So,
We are
record away if
recording.
you want, and I'll start. Okay?
Yep.
Good. Well, welcome everyone to what is a new thing for me. I'm trying this out today as a sort of experiment to see if what I normally do actually comes across well in this format with my presentations and the things I want you to do. And the aim is, if it does work, then I'm going to do a longer series starting in sort of mid-November and take you through something more substantial. But today, if you've read the blurb that Steve put out, we're going to do two different things, a bit of a break in the middle. So in a minute, we're going to look at some idioms from Matthew's Gospel. I call them idioms and insights. And then after the break, so to speak, 5-minute break, we're going to go to Galilee and do some fishing, see what that's all about. So if you're ready to start, so my first question is, what is an idiom? It's no good me saying we're doing idioms if we don't know what it is. This is where I can ask my first question. Does anyone want to give me a good definition or explanation of what an idiom actually is?
Get our microphone on.
This is where I need to know who's going to speak, isn't it? And I don't listen to anyone.
A saying.
Is someone talking there, Steve?
Yeah, that's me.
Yeah, I know, but is someone answering my question?
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, very quiet. You need to speak up.
Oh, can you hear me? Can you hear me, Mother?
Yeah.
I can hear you a bit more now, yeah?
Right. An idiom's a figure of speech. Will that do?
Yeah, that's part of it, certainly. Anything else? Well, it's something that's in one language can't be translated very easily directly into another one.
Right.
Yeah.
It's an expression that can't be translated literally. I've got a more sort of expansive definition here. It's something whose meaning cannot be worked out from just looking at the individual words. So we know what the words mean, but as a sentence, it doesn't necessarily make sense unless we understand it as an idiom. Let me give you an easy one to start with. We often say it's raining cats and dogs. Yeah, that's an idiom. And if you try and translate that into another language, they'll wonder what's happening to your pets. Okay? But we know that it's nothing to do with real cats and dogs. We know that's an expression which is peculiar to our language, and we know straight away that it's been a bad day. Yeah? Here's another one, but this is from another language. To fold up your umbrella. So that's not English. But if that was in another language, we'd have to understand what it meant. Has anyone heard that expression in French? Tell you it's in French. French say this. Anyone heard of it?
No.
Probably not. Okay, it's not a very nice one. If someone's folded up their umbrella, it means they died.
Oh.
Oh, wow.
What sort of expression would we use instead?
Kick the bucket.
Kick the
Pop their
bucket,
clogs.
yeah.
Pop their clogs.
Pop your clogs, yes. Okay, there's a whole load of those. That's the sort of thing that an idiom is. So it'd be an idiom in the original language, and it's been translated, comes into English, and if it's not translated very well, we miss the meaning completely. Okay, here's one. Have a guess at this. I don't know which language this comes from. To meet four eyes. What do you think's happening there?
No idea.
Well, we're not doing it at the moment. We're not meeting with four eyes. In fact, there's loads of eyes. I can see that. But to meet with four eyes means you're meeting face to face. Okay, four eyes, my eyes, your eyes. That's an expression in some particular language or other. Okay, there's another very peculiar one. I don't know where this one comes from. There are neither bears nor forest is a way of saying it's completely false.
Oh, wow.
You just want to understand that if that was translated like that. And to bury your hand in the dish is to, well, waste your time, idle it away, and so on. Anyway, we're going to meet some of these idioms, particularly Hebrew idioms, in the Gospels, because Jesus was speaking in Hebrew, and when he was using particular phrases that they understood, they haven't always been translated properly or come through to us. So we're going to look at a couple of passages, which means I'm about to change the PowerPoint and hope this works. I close that one, open. Screen staring has stopped.
No,
That's annoying. Oh,
To reshare when you've got your.
okay. Let me. No, that ain't going to work. I'll end the show again. If I do that to it, you all still seeing me?
Yes.
Can you see what I'm doing? You see me fumbling around?
No.
I can see large pictures of people now.
Yeah, so can I. I can't find my. Oh, wait a minute. There we are. Let's try that.
Ah,
Can you now see something with passages on?
Two passages.
Yeah.
Two passages. Okay, so if you have a look in Matthew's Gospel and find those two passages, which means give you a couple of minutes to find them, they're close together, and also have a quick sort of read through, and then we'll talk about various things in there that we find.
Mm. 15.
I picked these because they're absolutely full of Hebraic expressions. It's Jesus talking. He's talking to his disciples. We have a Jewish teacher talking to Jewish disciples, and he's saying all sorts of things which, even if they've been translated fairly well, we may well miss the meaning of. So have you at least found them? You got them in front of you?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, there's something in common to both of them. I'm going to start with what's in common in both passages, which means focusing in on those two verses.
Oh, yeah.
16:19 and 18:18. You should find, if I've got my numbers right, that they both contain the same sort of thing. Anyone want to say what they think that is?
Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven.
Yeah.
And
whatever you loose.
whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven.
Right. It's the old phrase binding and loosing, which occurs in both cases. We'll look at them in the sort of separate context in a minute, but that's something that's puzzled people a great deal. And you've sometimes heard that phrase taken completely out of context and referring to something completely different to what's going on here. But what we need to know that even the Greek is bind and loose, but what did that mean when Jesus was speaking as a Jew? To bind means to forbid, and to loose means to allow. In other words, these were terms used in rabbinic judgments and in rabbinic literature, legal rulings and so on, to express something that was permitted or something that was forbidden. So typically, I bind you from doing this means you're not allowed to do it. I loose you to do this means that's okay, that is permitted. See the idea?
Yeah.
So someone might have asked a rabbi, can I do this on the Sabbath? And he would say, I bind you from doing that on the Sabbath. Or he may say, no, I loose you to do that. That's okay. So once you've understood that, it becomes a bit more obvious, actually, that, you know, binding something means not allowing it to happen. We make sort of binding agreements, but these are ones that are forbidden and so on. So making binding rulings, or indeed making loosing rulings, what's going on here? In the first one, it's Peter that's being told he can do this. This is in chapter 16, isn't it? We're going to look at the keys in a minute. But the first bit of the text is that he's going to be given some keys, and then he's going to be told that when he makes decisions of binding or of loosing, then something's going to happen. In other words, heaven is involved. And this is about him making judgments, making decisions. It's not that if he says something, God's automatically going to agree with it. It's not that way round. But if he makes a decision of this kind, then he will have God's backing. Why? Because he will have got it right in the first place. In other words, God will have given him the right thing to say, helped him to make the right decision. Heaven is behind him in this particular way. Now you see what Jesus is doing here is preparing the way for when he's not there. His disciples are in charge, and as a result, they're going to have to deal with all the complications that come out of, well, basically running church, if you like, but being in charge of God's people. And exactly like the rabbis had to do in the past, when the people would come to them and say, what's your decision on this? What do I do about that? Peter is going to face this time and time again, because he's going to be, a leader in charge. And that is a tremendous responsibility, if you think about it. If I was Peter in this situation and being told, okay, it'll be over to you, you're going to have to sort out all the problems, people are going to come to you with their issues, you've got to tell them what's allowed and what isn't allowed, I would sort of panic and run away. But Jesus here is saying that responsibility, you can have some reassurance as well that you will get this right, not because whatever you say, God will agree, but God will make sure you come to the right decision in the first place. God is inspiring you. God is guiding you. Okay, do you understand that?
Yes. Paul, can I ask a question at this point?
Indeed.
That I think I've heard, I'm not a Greek scholar, but in the Greek it says, whatever you bind on earth shall already have been bound in heaven.
Right. That's an interesting point. I'm also not a Greek scholar, but what I do actually have somewhere the Greek text.
It is
And
correct.
I can't tell, because I don't know enough Greek, I can't tell whether those tenses are right. But
It's in the future perfect tense.
okay, so
Will have been bound.
let me catch up with you on this.
Yeah.
Yes, that's right. I've got a translation underneath the Greek text that says, whatever you bind on earth will have been bound. Is that what you're saying, David?
Yes, that's correct. Yeah.
Yes.
So this
Okay.
is God's backing. He's always the inspiration, if you like, that he'll be given to do exactly what you've said.
Yeah.
Very interesting insight, that though.
So, in other words,
Binding.
God has already decided what the answer would be, and he's going to share it with Peter. Okay. I've got feedback now. I can hear myself. I'm getting some feedback on myself. Okay.
I can't
Can you hear
do
me?
anything about that other than mute you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. 'Cause I can hear myself feeding back as well.
You turn your loudspeakers or your volume down a bit.
Me?
Yeah, have you got a way of doing that?
Not at the moment, because my screen isn't there at
I
all.
can't see the screen to do it.
Do that. I'll have to come out of it. I don't know why this suddenly started happening.
No,
Anyway,
nothing's changed.
I'll keep going. It's just a bit weird. Anyway, the point is that if you have this sort of responsibility and you don't have this reassurance, you're going to find it very difficult to make decisions because you'll be panicking, you'll be terrified. And that sort of thing doesn't lead to good decision making. It leads to you feeling a bit sort of insecure, a bit sort of paralyzed by the whole thing. Now, when we find the same thing in Matthew 18:18, this time it's not just Peter, it's the other apostles too. Okay? Because he's now talking to them all, not just to Peter. We'll come back to the other passage and look more at Peter later. Actually, that's better now. My voice has gone back to normal.
Yeah.
Excellent. Now, in Matthew 18:18, this is for all of them, because not just Peter, but all the apostles are going to have a role in helping run the church, put it that way. But the thing about this verse is that it must be put in the context of what's going on here. And the context is discipline. Okay, so this verse, that's when we go back to verse 15 onwards. It starts with, if your brother sins against you. In other words, they are now dealing with a very important thing that's going to crop up, inevitably going to crop up. What happens when a brother goes wrong, when the brother sins, so on. And there's a whole sort of procedure to go through here. That firstly you show him his fault, see if the two of you can sort it out, and then see if he listens to you, and that's great if he does. If he won't, then you move on to the next stage, and you take others along. And there's this little quote here, which goes back to Deuteronomy. Can you see that? That every matter may be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. And that still doesn't work. Then you go on to the next stage, and basically you tell everybody, and maybe even, deal based severely with this. And again, the reassurance comes in that the decision you have to make in this very awkward situation will already have been agreed in heaven, so you will again get it right. Okay? Now, at this point, it's well worth pointing out that verse 19, which is always taken out of context, always applied all over the place, needs to be understood back, well, it's 19 and 20 actually. This whole business, everybody quotes, where 2 or 3 come together in my name, there am I with them. And they apply it to just about everything they can think of whenever there's not many people around. The context is still church discipline. In other words, the 2 or 3 in verse 20 has to go back to verse 16, because 16 is you've taken 1 or 2 others, and there's you yourself, add 1 or 2 others, and who have you got? 2 or 3. So the 2 or 3 coming together in Jesus' name for this purpose, that's where the promise is, I am with you. In other words, again, you will get it right, you will make the right decision, because although I'm going to be in heaven, it will have already been decided in heaven. So do you understand verse 20 now? It's not something that you can just apply all over the place, because it is actually to do with disciplining or sorting out procedure within a church when something's gone wrong.
I'll have to be careful when I quote you.
Does that help that?
That's amazing.
And even if 2 of you on earth agree about anything you ask for, again, that's often taken out of context. If 2 of you on earth agree about anything at all, absolutely anything, but out of the context is still within the business of church discipline. It's not a blank check.
David.
Okay? I can hear myself again. It's getting awkward again.
David, when you put your microphone back on, we're getting all.
It's not sounding good. Everyone's got feedback.
Yeah, it's David Sell's fault, I think.
Yes.
Mute yourself. Now try it.
I'm okay now.
Yeah, it's all David's fault.
Oh, I see. So when David speaks, we all get everybody. Well, he can still speak. You just have to remember to turn it up again.
You can use the chat for him.
So those 2 verses, 19 and 20, all the business of 2 people and asking and agreeing and sorting something out, at least it needs to be applied to church discipline. Why has it got thrown out of context and made to appear to be absolutely anything? Well, because we don't do church discipline properly. How many churches actually do church discipline according to verse 15, 16, 17, and so on? If you don't, then you're left with 18, 19, and 20, and you don't know what to do with it. So it becomes taken all over the place. Okay? So that's explained the binding and loosing and so on. Here's some, did it ever actually happen? Acts 6. Have a look at what's happening in Acts 6. This was a situation that they had to deal with early on. It's the Ananias and Sapphira business. You all know what happened to them?
Yeah.
Have a look. Beginning of Acts 6.
Died.
Really sad, this.
Have I got this right?
No.
No, I haven't, have I? What have I got wrong? Got the number
Chapter
one?
5.
5, is it?
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. Okay, I never get my numbers right, you know. I was only a maths teacher for 33 years. You can't expect too much. So it is that
I've moved my
5.
microphone. Is that better sound-wise?
Yeah. Yeah.
For me. How amazing that I didn't spot that earlier. Actually, I'm wondering whether I mean Acts 6 anyway. But anyway, in Acts 5, we've got this business of Ananias and Sapphira. And, well, Peter was in charge of things. And in fact, you've got heaven sort of backing him up because of what happened to them, really. So, but I've only said probably there. And I did mean Acts 6 as well, because in Acts 6 as well, they make another decision.
Yeah.
So Acts 6 is also relevant as a possibility, because they had to decide how to deal with the widows who needed food, didn't they? So the 12 gathered all the disciples together and said, it's not right to do this, so choose 7 men, and so on. Did they get that decision right? Yes, we believe they did, because whatever they were agreeing on, it was backed up by heaven. But the main example, never mind about those too much perhaps, Acts 15, where they had to have this big council in Jerusalem once the Gentiles were coming in. And that created the first sort of big controversy that they had to sort out, which could easily have split the church. Do we allow Gentiles to come in without first circumcising them? What we'd command them to keep, and so on. And we haven't got time to read the whole of this passage again. You can, with this sort of background in mind, you can try it sometime. But they have a fascinating set of situations where they meet to consider it after much discussion, and Peter gets up and says something, and then the whole assembly becomes silent as they listen, and then James speaks up, and so on. They're going through a process which eventually they have to bind or loose in some way. They have to come to the equivalent of some kind of rabbinic decision, what to do here. What do we command them to do? What do we not command them to do? And Peter is basically trying to loose them from other things that might have been told that they had to do, set them free from it. And we find in verse 13 that that James agrees with this. They've come to some decision. But later on in verse 20, they write to tell them the things that they should do. So they've loosed them from lots of these things, but they eventually bind them to do certain things. And then they write it up in the letter in verse 23 and send it off. So it becomes the official binding and loosing decision that the apostles have made there.
Interesting, yeah. Good.
So that's probably the best application I can find of what Jesus promised to Peter and the other apostles actually happening. But maybe there's other little ones throughout the book of Acts as well, where they had to make these important decisions. I think it means for us as well that we can trust what they did and what the scriptures say about it, because we've had this reassurance from Jesus while he was on earth that it would indeed be backed up by heaven. Right. So we have a look at the keys. This is back in Matthew 16 now. And we all know about poor old Peter getting the keys, don't we? Because that seems to sort of mean that he's got to spend all eternity standing outside the pearly gates. Not a great reward for a life of service. I hope someone takes over from time to time and gives him a break. I thought poor Peter deserves better than this. But of course, it's not that at all. Something's going on. Jesus wouldn't have said this. He wouldn't have said, I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, if he didn't mean something. So we're going to look at the keys on the rock here. Peter with the keys and Peter the rock. Now, keys obviously are important things. And usually keys are entrusted to someone who is very trustworthy. keys represent responsibility and also reliability. And in the old days, the main keys that they had would be the keys to the temple. And the keys to the temple, there's something interesting about them in Isaiah. So I'd like you to have a look in Isaiah 22. And I put one verse down, but it's part of a longer passage. And what I mean by this being a sort of idiom or something is that when Peter heard Jesus talking about keys, he would have thought about this sort of passage. He would have understood in the past something important about keys. And this is the best illustration of keys.
Somebody's typing.
Now let's hope I've got the right numbers this time. You reckon there's any keys in chapter 22?
There are.
Once we get to verse... Well, we're actually going to go back to verse 15 in a moment, but verse 22, I will place on his shoulder the keys to the house of David, and what he opens no one can shut, what he shuts no one can open. Is that familiar, that verse?
Yeah.
Where do you read that again?
Revelation.
Book of Revelation, don't you? Yes. So it's almost like prophetic here in Isaiah 22. But what's actually happened is, go back to verse 20, and someone called Eliakim, son of Hilkiah, he is the one that's going to be clothed and given authority, and on his shoulder the keys to the house of David. And he actually was going to be the main sort of key holder of the temple. And why is that? Because he was replacing someone called Shebna. And if you go back to verse 15, Shebna is in disgrace. And Shebna is about to be sacked. So from verses 15 to 19, you learn about Shebna, who is going to be deposed from office and ousted from his position. Now, actually, I don't know I'm about to contradict what I've just said here, but when we look at who they were, both Eliakim and Shebna were high officials under King Hezekiah. Eliakim was the palace administrator, and Shebna was the secretary. So, sorry, in this case, it's not the temple, it's the palace, I think. It's the same illustration. What had happened is that Shebna had done something really wrong. He had cut out a grave for himself. That's in verse 16. Cut out a grave for himself. He was so proud and coveting his position, what he actually did was made sure that there was this big, conspicuous, rock-hewn tomb, and in fact, it's been found archaeologically. Part of it's been found, and there's an inscription on it. So we know he actually built himself a tomb, probably in the palace, therefore. But basically, he had overstepped himself and thought of himself too highly. And as a result of that, God is going to just roll him up, throw him away, and he's going to give the keys to someone else. And that someone else is Eliakim, because Eliakim was more humble and more worthy. And so he was going to be elevated to that position. So in other words, the keys were something that could only be given to someone who is humble and reliable, and someone who will not use them for their own glorification, and so on. So that's one example of the keys. So that was the palace. I got that bit muddled up. That was the palace. We're going to look at the temple in a minute. But, you understand what I've said on that?
Yeah.
Any comments? Anything you want to say on Isaiah 22? That sounds like a resounding no. Are we okay to move on?
Yeah.
Okay, have a look at 1 Chronicles 9 then. Because this is the temple. And these are the gatekeepers at the temple. And they had great responsibility each morning to open up the temple. Now, I didn't realize this. I've recently seen a model of the temple, and I was actually shown the little place where they used to sleep overnight, and the keys would be kept sort of in a box under the floor, not quite under the floorboards, but there was a hole in the floor, and they used to sleep sort of on top of the keys, ready for the next morning. And what we've got here in 1 Chronicles 9, if I can catch up with you. The gatekeepers had to be assigned to their positions of trust, and the gatekeepers were on the 4 sides and had their duties. The 4 principal gatekeepers, this is from verse 26, who were Levites, were entrusted with responsibility for the room. They'd spend the night stationed around the house of God, because they're to guard it, and they had charge of the key for opening it each morning. Seems a bit strange, doesn't it, sort of having to open the temple up each morning, just sort of think it's there and it's open, but certain bits of it had to be locked up at times. And so 4 very important people were entrusted with the responsibility of looking after the key. There's a story, I guess it's just a rabbinic story, concerning the destruction of the first temple. And because it all gone wrong, those with the keys at the time acknowledged that they had failed as stewards. And they confessed as follows: "We have failed at being faithful stewards. Let these keys be given back to you." And they threw them up towards heaven, and the form of a hand came down and received them, as though they were throwing the keys back up to God, the rightful owner. And there's something in 2 Baruch. Now, Baruch is not in the Bible. I hope you know that. Any idea what 2 Baruch is? It's not even in the Apocrypha. It's in the next level. But it's interesting that, just have a read of that, if you can see it all. Hope you can. It's what happens if you've been found to be a false steward. You have to give the keys up. Same sort of idea. Throw them back up towards God. And we've been found to be false stewards. So it was a very important responsibility, and nobody was allowed to keep the keys if they weren't shown to be reliable enough. Now, that explains, to some extent, back in Matthew, why Jesus was going on to talk about Peter as the rock. Because you don't give someone the keys unless they have the right sort of character. And Peter was going to be sufficiently changed so he would become the rock. So God owns the keys, but Peter will be a faithful steward to the keys of the kingdom. I said they're not the gates of heaven. He's not going to be outside the pearly gates forever, but he's got some kind of responsibility for the kingdom. Why? Because he is going to become solid as a rock. Now, you know about Peter's name, don't you? His name means rock. Have you heard all about this?
Yeah.
Okay. So in Greek, it says you are Petros, and then the sort of pun going on here, because Jesus says, and on this Petra, well, in Greek it's a pun. I'll come back to that in a minute because that's quite interesting. But the word Petra is bedrock. It's not just a little bit of rock, a clump of rock, or something you pick up and throw. This is solid bedrock. Okay, you are Petros, and on this Petra, on this bedrock, you are going to be solid, firm foundation, and so on. I've heard it said, thought Jesus didn't speak Greek. How come he's using the Greek here as a sort of pun if he's really speaking Hebrew? But actually, they would understand Greek, and some Greek words did sort of go into Hebrew in the same sort of way, like they do across different languages. So it seems to work, even if you're trying to say, well, it's a Jewish teacher talking to a Jewish person. You know, there is a place called Petra. Have you ever seen that place, Petra, in Jordan?
Yep.
What does it look like?
Massive.
rock.
So,
Solid rock, yeah?
mm,
The picture you're normally shown is the treasury, which is sort of dug into the hillside, isn't it? And it's red, very red. Petra, that city, is known as the rose-red city, half as old as time or something, as though it goes back a long, long way. But this was the sort of thing that he was saying, that Peter himself was going to become rock-like. He was going to become a reliable individual. And I think there's a link back here to Isaiah again. Have a look in Isaiah 51. Who in the past have been a reliable rock-like figure? Even though, like Peter, had made lots of mistakes.
David the penitent psalm.
Well, I didn't hear that. Someone
Sorry,
saying-
forget that one, Paul.
Okay.
What he said.
Isaiah 51. Who is the rock figure there? It says, look to the rock.
Look unto
it's
Abraham.
Abraham, it says.
Abraham, yeah. And indeed Sarah as well gets
Yeah.
a look in. Look to the rock from which you were cut and to the quarry from which you were hewn. Look to Abraham your father and Sarah who gave you birth. So in the past, God relied upon Abraham as a rock-like person. And again, I'm sure all these little references that we just see as words in English, Peter would have known. Oh, keys, yes. Rock, yes. I understand what you're trying to tell me, dear Jesus. And there's another sort of rabbinic text, which is a sort of story about a king wanting to build a palace and searching for solid rock and so on. And the whole point of the story is that it's like God created the world and he saw all the wicked people that was going to come and everything. You might have thought he would have given up, but actually the Holy One looked ahead and saw Abraham. One day a man will be born, Abraham, and here is solid rock on which I can build my people. So he was almost like waiting for Abraham to come along so that he could start to build his people upon the rock-like person of Abraham. Of course, Abraham made mistakes, and of course Peter was going on to make mistakes, but he was going to become a much better person. He was going to become more solid. Because what was his name earlier? Before he was, well, what is his name before he was given the name Peter? He was, of course, Simon. Do you know what Simon means? The name Simon means something. It means reed. Okay? It means a reed, something that is easily bent and swayed in the wind. And about the difference between being called a rock and a reed, there's a big difference in your character. I used to translate it as Jesus is saying here to Peter, you are rocky and on this bedrock I will build. And then someone pointed out, but someone who's rocky is a bit unstable, isn't it? Isn't that what rocky means? Unstable. And I thought, okay. Perhaps it should be you are rock-like. And on this bedrock I will build, because that's the stability that's needed here. And the Peter who was easily swayed and bent and beforehand, after Pentecost, was going to become rock-like, and therefore he would be the right person that could do the binding and the loosing that we were talking about earlier. Okay? I'm going to say two other quick things from these passages before we get to our halfway point. Any comments so far?
Yeah. Rocky is an idiom as well, isn't it?
In what sense? Go on.
Because somebody that's rocky, it's idiomatic, isn't it?
Yeah, okay.
No, it's not literal, is it?
Yeah, exactly. It's descriptive of them, yes. It's trying to say something about their character, yeah. Yeah. So, but like a lot of names, I suppose, are got something like that about it, haven't they, if they're meant to be describing something. So I want to say something else on these two passages. These are the two passages that contain the word church. Okay? If you've still got them in front of you, you will find in both cases Jesus refers to the church. And you might have been told these are the only two places in the gospel where the word church occurs. In one case, it's I will build my church, and in the other case, it's if it doesn't listen to you, take it to the whole church. Now, what do you think about the fact of Jesus using the word church? Does that make sense?
But in my Bible, it keeps saying that the word church is wrong because I've got a One New Man Bible. It keeps referring to congregation or called out ones, not church.
Excellent. You've got a very good version. We all agree we like the One New Man Bible, don't we?
Yeah.
Yeah, clearly. Okay, it's an anomaly. Firstly, there's no way Jesus could have used the word church. It wouldn't have made any sense if he'd have used that word to the disciples, because they would have gone sort of scratching their head and thinking, what is he on about? Don't understand that. And of course, he was using, well, Hebrew, and the Hebrew becomes Greek. Okay? And the Greek is ecclesia. You heard that word, ecclesia, in Greek?
Yep.
The word for church. We get ecclesiastical from it and things like that. So why on earth do we have the word church there in these two places? And the answer is very simple and at the same time very disturbing, really. It was because it was forced into the translation by King James. The authorized version, the version he authorized, was an attempt to show that the hierarchical established church of which he was the head was the one that Jesus was talking about. So he insisted, he laid actually down 15 edicts to the translators: you must include the word church whenever you see ecclesia, and you must also use words like bishop and ordained, and all the sort of words that were there within the hierarchical Church of England at the time. In other words, it was a totally political thing and forced upon the translation. It's an imposition, it's an implanted word into the translation. It's not a translation of ecclesia. What is the translation? Well, ecclesia means called out ones. And why is ecclesia in the text? Because Jesus would have used a Hebrew word like kahal, and kahal means gathering, community, congregation, if you like, in exactly the same way as when God brought the Israelites out of Egypt, he called them my community, my people, and so on. He would have used that same word. So Jesus is here saying, I will build my community, people. And how will he build them? From those who come to the same confession of faith as Peter has just done, the same revelation of his messiahship, and so on. And in some languages, you get a proper translation, really. In French, you know what the French for church is? Back to French again. You know French for church? Église. Église, yes, which is like ecclesia. And in Spanish, iglesia is also a better translation of ecclesia. Even the Welsh have a word which looks a bit like ecclesia, but I'm not going to try and pronounce any Welsh words out in public. But we've translated it church, which is not the right translation. It shouldn't be there. And in fact, all the way through the New Testament, even when Paul mentions the word church, it's still ecclesia. It's still a community of God's people. Even right to the book of Revelation, the 7 churches, don't think of churches as we know them today. Instead, they were the gathered community of God's people in these various places. So those 2 places where the word church is, if you've got a Bible that's got the word church, then feel free to cross it out and put something else there that's in a better translation. And I really want to have a break now so we can go fishing. I was going to tell you something else, but I'm going to leave that. Okay? So I'm going to leave you with a teaser there. There's something else interesting, but I may not have time for it. So we might do that another time. Anything else on these 2 passages or anything we've said so far before we have a break? Because we've had 45 minutes.
Paul, just to say, you I might be preempting what you might have wanted to say. It's in terms of cosmic geography about the place where that was said to Peter.
Oh, okay. No, that wasn't
So
the point. Go on.
That Caesarea Philippi at the base of Mount Hermon
Exactly, yeah.
would have been known by the disciples there as the gates where to Sheol, where the underworld was.
Yeah.
And so lots of fallen Elohim or demonic activity. And maybe this was Jesus as he looks towards the cross. This is right towards the end of his ministry when he's moving towards Jerusalem. And it was going to be very soon when he would hold the keys of the kingdom in terms of life and death and the fate of the fallen Elohim. This is the work of Michael Heiser and people like him concerned cosmic geography, the unseen realm, which would have been very familiar to the Hebrew people.
Yeah. So you're referring there to the phrase, the gates of Hades will not overcome it.
Yeah.
At the base of Mount Hermon in that area, near Banias, I think it was, that's where they would think of it as being the opening into the demonic world and so on. Yes, it's interesting. It's way up there in the north, isn't it? And it was in the territory of Dan, I think, in the tribal times. And Dan was one of the most idolatrous tribes, I think. They eventually lost something or moved or something. It seems to have gone back into their history as a place of not good things. And Jesus deliberately took them there at this point, didn't he? There's all sorts of extra things in these passages like that. Just the very statement of Peter, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. You could unpack that for ages because he's saying something very profound here. He knows about Messiah, so he's saying you are the Messiah, but what he says after that, the Son of the living God, is actually a mighty revelation that we don't understand now because, well, of course we know Jesus is the Son of the living God. That was something quite epic for Peter to come out with at that point. And no wonder he says, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah. This was not revealed to you by man. And at that point he says, right, now I can see a Peter in you and I'm going to transform you. And then all these other things will happen afterwards. So, yeah, great. Any other comments on that? Happy to extend it for a moment if you want to say more. Okay. I'm going to have to change PowerPoints again for a minute while we get ready for the next thing. So can you bear with me? I don't know what's going to happen here. You might lose me for a minute.
What have I done?
You can still see me. But I'm going to close. Well, let's get rid of that one. Here we are. Can you see all my stuff what I'm coming up with? Here we go. We're going to go fishing. Do I have to share this again, or can you see it?
At the moment, we can only see Rocky.
Resume share. Okay. Ooh, let's get rid of that one. Screen staring and shop. Get rid of that. Okay. Share. There we go. Are we okay? We're getting there.
We have Jesus and his Jewish world fishing in Galilee.
That's the one. Excellent.
I think your microphone's off, as I can see all the microphones at one of our.
Right. This is a very fancy presentation, and you'll like this. Okay. We're going fishing in Galilee. Now, on the next slide, there's going to be lots of text. We're not going to look them all up yet, but if you want to write them down ready, that might help. So those are the passages which I hope what I'm going to say will help illuminate these. And obviously you can spend some more time looking at them later. But there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. All familiar in some ways, but hopefully will become more familiar afterwards. The ones in brackets are just parallel to the ones outside. So Mark and Matthew are the same passages. So make a note of those and get ready eventually to have a look at them. But before we get there, I need sort out what I'm going to say. Anyone know what the Hebrew word for fish is? Anyone know the Hebrew alphabet?
Yeah.
One of those letters means fish. It's noon. N-U-N. Pronounced noon. Means fish. Every Hebrew letter means a word as well, doesn't it? You know, bet means house, and gimel means camel and things like that. But noon means fish. Can you think of anyone in the Old Testament who was the son of Noon?
Yes.
Joshua. Always used to think it was the son of a nun, which made it sound very strange to be the son of a nun. But now you realise it's son of Noon. It probably means he had a name like we have Fisher. Yeah? Or like a well-known weatherman in the past, you know. He was the son of a fisherman or something. Right, so those are the passages we're going to look at. And before we get there, here's a map. Can you all see that map?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's Galilee, right? And have a good look round, and I hope that some of those places will become interesting. Do you like my fancy background, my wallpaper behind it?
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, took ages finding that. All the trouble I go to. Anyway, what have we got here? Here's the first, Sea of Galilee, okay. Right, Jesus settled here, Peter lived here. Where's that going to point to? Can you see the place on the map? Capernaum, got it? Right, okay, what the next one is? Place called Seven Springs in John 21. Can you find that on the map? It's there, it's Tabqa. That's the scene generally regarded as the setting for John 21. You know when they had the breakfast on the shore? Okay, it means Seven Springs. If you've been to Israel, I'm sure a few of you have, you've probably gone there because everywhere like that, there's a church, isn't there? But Capernaum was the main centre. It was a place where Peter had a house. Capernaum probably means village of Nahum, Kafar Nahum. That's probably it's got its name from, village of Nahum, but not the Nahum that we know of from the Bible, probably another Nahum. And that's where Peter, Andrew, James and John all lived and worked around there, around Capernaum, that particular part of Galilee. Where did Mary come from?
Magdalene.
Yeah, Mary Magdalene means Mary Magdala, and it's the place of dried fish. Probably because that's the place where they took all the fish to be dried before they were then moved on somewhere else, probably dried and salted and so on. I think that's the place where they found what's often called the Jesus boat. Have you heard of the Jesus boat?
Yeah.
It's somehow come out of the mud and the silt of the place, and I think it was found there, and it looks like one of the boats. We'll talk about the boats later anyway. The main city that was built by the Romans is Tiberias, yeah. Not a biblical town, built in the early 1st century, so it's not in the Gospels, but it became the largest city there. I think moving on to the other side here, the land of the... Can you read all that, or are you... Anyway, the land of the Gergesenes?
Yeah.
Well, that's there. That's where, when Jesus crossed the lake and met Legion with all the demons that he healed, that's there. House of Fish. Where's the House of Fish?
Bethsaida.
Bethsaida, yes. Bet meaning house, Saida, fish. House of Fish.
Yeah.
That's all I know about it. It's just what it's called. That's it. Okay. That's given you a little bit of idea. That was the main fishing area around the north, particularly the northwest side of Galilee. The interesting thing is that fishing techniques from the New Testament onwards didn't really change until the mid-1950s. They had the same sort of boats, the same sort of nets, right up to the 1950s, exactly the same as back in the day of Jesus. And although some new fish had been introduced into the lake more recently, it was almost the same kind of fish as well. And originally, the fish had about 18 the lake had about 18 different species in them, of which 10 were commercial. And that means, of course, they were edible. And that would be to do with whether they were clean or unclean. So here's the main fish that they used to fish in those days. And the first one looks like that. It's called the musht fish. The musht fish. This would be between 9 and 16 inches long. And probably would weigh up to 2 pounds. Here it is again. And it was one of the main fish that was fished for. It would go around in shoals. It was also known as the comb fish. In fact, I think the word musht means comb. Can you see its comb on its back? Okay, it's like the large dorsal fin. Looks a little bit like a comb, apparently. And they would move around in very large shoals. And it was also known as the nurse fish. Known as the nurse fish because it would take the fertilized eggs into its mouth for 2 or 3 weeks until they hatched. So it was very used to having things in its mouth. And when it didn't have any fertilized eggs, a sort of broody mushed fish would pick up all sorts of things from the bottom and carry them around for a while, usually just pebbles and things like that. And the most famous mushed fish is, if you go to the lake, you're bound to have had it. It was a form of tilapia called Tilapia galilea, also known as St. Peter's fish. And one of the reasons why it's so popular is it's very easy to fillet. The bones are very small and you can easily take them out. So that's the mushed fish. There he is again, floating in. Looks like I've got another one here. I've got a picture of him here with his mouth open just to convince you that he really did, or she really did, so whoever it was, like to take things into their mouths and so on. Okay, they actually would tend to eat plankton. They would eat plankton. The next kind of fish is the binny or barbel. Can you see its barbs? You know what we mean by that?
Sure.
The barbs are like the whiskers. Look at its mouth. Okay? It's got sort of barbs sticking down. And there. This was a part of the carp family. There's 3 different kinds of binny fish. But they would feed on smaller fish, perhaps sardines and other small fry. These were also large, very fleshy, often used for a Sabbath meal or for feasts. So they were commercially very popular as well. And the other main kind would be, oh, sorry, that's the name appeared. Binny or barbel, in case you were wondering what it's called. And the other kind of fish I've already mentioned is the sardine. Okay, and that's the sardine. Okay, much smaller, but a staple diet. In fact, just over half of the total catch on the lake was sardines. Just so many of them. In fact, at night, you would catch tons and tons of these fish. And because they were often eaten by the binny fish, they were often caught together. Okay? So those are the fish. Any comments on that? Okay. Got that? These are the nets. The nets next. Here's the first and most important net. It's called the seine net, also known as the drag net. Okay, because it was dragged along. Let me show you the pictures first, and then I'll talk more about it. You can see that picture. That's how it was used. It's a big, big net and there's men on either side dragging it in. Yeah? And there's another picture of it, which will become useful in a minute when I talk about different features of it. Okay, so it's a huge drag net. It's like a long wall. It could be up to 300 meters long. In the middle, it was always taller in the middle. It would be about 8 meters. And even at the wings, the edges, before it really tapered off to nothing, it would still be about 3 or 4 meters. And as you can see on this one, it had to have some lead weights on the bottom and some floaters, corks or something like that on the head, so that it would actually stay upright. So it was weighted with sinkers and had floats on the top. And of course, ropes in order to drag it back in. Now, if you look at that, how many men can you see in that picture?
Whoa.
14 and 2 in the boat, I think, is it?
Yeah, you see some in the boat, can you? That's clever. Yeah. Good eyesight. Yeah, it took 16 men. That's right, a crew of 16 men to do this, particularly for the longer ones of this kind. It was used in the early morning. And obviously there's a boat there because there was a boat used, but you didn't fish from the boat. The way it worked was that the net was arranged on a sort of flat table surface at the stern of the boat. And actually half the crew, maybe 7 or 8 at most, stayed on shore with the first rope. And then the boat sailed out into the sea with the rope trailing, and then it would turn parallel to the shore, spreading the net, and then turn back to the shore where the second set of ropes would be lowered, and then the other half of the crew would get out and take that rope. The boat was then what's called detained, which means just left to one side. It done its job. The boat was then not used because it was just to take the thing out there. And then came the hard work, the job of dragging it ashore, pulling it in like this great wall. And the men would actually start off in the water up to their waists as they started to pull it out. And then once the first man got on the shore, he would go back in and grab hold of the rope back in the water again and start to pull it in that way. Hard work. Sometimes the net got caught on things, and that's where the other 2 people, maybe the skipper and his second in charge, might then have to either take the boat out or swim to go and release the net. Now, actually, it traps them extremely well. You can see the shape of it, the way it curves and so on. It really does just, they've got nowhere to go, the fish. They can't dive underneath very easily. They can't swim around it. They're trapped. And it can take an hour to take the net out and bring it back and pull it back into shore. And then once they've done that and taken all the fish out, they can move on to another part of the lake, and they might repeat that. Remember, this was done in the daytime. This was early morning onwards. They might do this 8 times, moving along the shore. Okay, dragging in the fish each time. It needed a large boat, usually about 8 meters long, 2.5 meters wide, and that's the kind of boat that was uncovered in the mud. Drag nets were used all over the ancient world. There's even records of them being used in Egypt in the 3rd century BC. And whatever's been dragged in then had to be sorted on the land. So you had to spend a lot of time afterwards. Maybe you had other hired hands who would come along and then sort the fish out into different piles and throw away what was useless and so on. The owner of the boat, who also owned the net, got 40% of the income. The owner of the boat, yes, got 40%. The crew had to divide 60% of the income between them. The skipper got a double portion. The second in command got 1.5 shares. Others just got 1 share. Yeah. And other people could earn money by mending the nets afterwards. And this happened until the mid-1950s, and it caught about half the annual catch of all the big fish. Okay? Now, if you have a look at some of these texts here, including the one in Matthew that I think you saw earlier, these are all referring to dragnets. Okay? If you haven't got time for them all, just sort of pick one at random, but particularly look at the Matthew one. Let's pick one of the first three in the Old Testament and have a look. And then have a look at Matthew 13, and you see that Jesus is referring to a dragnet. So I'll stop for a minute while you look at some pictures. I think, hold on, put my Bible somewhere. I'm hoping that the one, something in Ezekiel actually, does it mention the word dragnet?
Yeah.
Well, mine only does in the sort of notes.
Yeah.
It does refer to a dragnet, but not in the context of the scripture.
Not the actual translation, but it's telling you in the notes that it's a
It
dragnet.
says fishnet in the,
Yeah. Sometimes you have to tell that from other things in the passage. I mean, I'm looking at the one in Ezekiel 26 that says, she will become a place to spread fishing nets. These were the nets that were spread. As we'll see later on in some of the gospel passages, when they were mending their nets because they'd spread them out, this would be what they were doing then.
It says dragnet in this.
I think in Habakkuk it mentions just getting the choice fish, the biggest and best fish this way. It might be used as a sort of illustration rather than a literal net. And that, of course, is what Jesus was doing, wasn't it? When he gave this parable, you notice, I'm looking at the one in Matthew, so that's where we're heading towards. Jesus says the kingdom of heaven is like a net that was let down into the lake, and it caught all kind of fish. That was what actually happened with the dragnet. It really did catch absolutely everything that was there, and then they had to sort it, and then they had to keep the good fish and throw the bad away. So this was the best way to catch all the really big fish like the musht and the binny. Okay, I'm going to show you the next net in a minute. Shall we go on?
Yes.
The next kind of net is the trammel net. The trammel net looks like that, which is a bit tricky to see until it's explained. So I'm going to show you some more pictures and then go back and look at it again. That's a sort of cross-section and a cutout of it, I think. I'll keep showing you more what they look like. And that's another one. Still looks a bit weird, like graph paper instead of proper net. That's a close-up of the actual part of it. Okay, I'll keep flicking through them as we look at what's going on here. The trammel net was a compound net. It had 3 layers, but held together by a single corked rope head, or head rope, I suppose, and of course a leaded foot rope. There's 2 external walls and 1 internal. Let's see where this comes across best. What they're trying to show there is the inside net with a smaller mesh and the outside net. So there's 2 walls of net with bigger mesh on the outside, and on the inside which actually you could slide up and down in it. So you could take that net out from between the other two. So it was a compound net of three things. So the two external walls were identical, and they had these, you can see there, the sort of bigger diamond shapes, and then the smaller ones is the middle net in there. And you see the idea of the fish, that they will swim through the bigger mesh and then get tangled in the finer mesh, and then they can't get out again. And you could obviously change the size of your mesh on the inside, depending on the kind of fish that you wanted to take. You didn't need a big boat for this, and usually you had a crew of about 4 men only that would take the net down and lower it into the water and then leave it. And this was the net that was used at night. So the seine net, the drag net, was in the day. This was at night time. So you went and you just lowered it down. And when it said that they were fishing all night, that's all they were doing. They laid the net down. They could then go off to sleep or something if they wanted. Although sometimes they tried to encourage the fish to swim into that net. But all they had to do was wait for the fish to catch themselves almost as they went in there. So it was just left standing as like a wall in the water. And then the net was hauled out. And this time the fish, this is the tricky bit, they then had to be removed by hand one by one because they were entangled in the net. The drag net had just gathered them all together and they were dragged onto the shore. Here, when you lifted your net out of the middle of it, you had all the fish wriggling around in it. So this is the net that they then had to pick the fish out. The idea of doing this net at night was that the fish wouldn't be able to see it. You know, they were swimming along in the water and then suddenly they would go into this net. And you can imagine as well that this net was often broken by the fish, and this was the one where they would have to mend their nets more regularly. That's the trammel net. And here's some text on it. Again, there's a couple in the Old Testament, which are interesting. And then there's the references in Mark and Luke, which is worth spending a bit more time on. So I'd recommend having a look at Ecclesiastes and Job, first of all, though, and see if you can work out why this is the trammel net. Not a wheel net, it's an illustration. It's God using the net as a sort of illustration of something. In Ecclesiastes, you should see something like a phrase like a cruel net or trap. If it just says the word caught, the word caught is literally entangled. This is the net that entangles you. But it's also known as the cruel net because of the way it just trapped them. And Job should be giving you the same idea, that you've been caught up in his nets. Anything on those first two, the Old Testament passages? Have you found them, or does it make sense?
I've got an evil net. Yeah.
This was seen as the more evil of the nets because you went into it and you just couldn't get out again. It wasn't just that you were snatched up.
In
Yeah.
Job 19, can you hear me? Sorry, in Job 19, it talks about being fenced up.
Yeah. Trapped and blocked.
Yeah.
It was a bit like a fence, wasn't it? You went through it and then you're drawn into it and then trapped. Yeah. So because they were familiar with this kind of net, even in those days, then it was used as an illustration, wasn't it? In the Gospels, in Matthew, Mark, Mark 1, Matthew 4, but in Mark, this is where they were fishing, and Jesus is about to call his disciples. I'll come back to this passage in a minute because there's other disciples, but in verse 19, it says, Jesus went a little further. He saw James, the son of Zebedee, and his brother John in a boat. And you can imagine that Zebedee was the owner of the boat. He owned the fishing company, and the two sons were working. It says they were preparing their nets. How do we know they were trammel nets?
Because they needed repairing.
They needed repairing. And what time of day was it, shall we say?
Oh.
I mean, this was daytime, yes?
Yeah.
In other words, they've been using them in the night. Okay, because if they were using the other nets, they'd be out there using the nets because the drag net was used during the daytime. So in the daytime, you spent your time preparing your nets ready for the next night, mending them, maybe even washing them. And it says nets, because a trammel net was a plural net. So the word net would refer to just one net, the drag net, but when it says preparing their nets, it would mean the different sections that they would have separated out for washing and so on. Also, in Mark, do you notice it refers to the hired men? End of verse 20. Okay, you hired other men then to help you either mend your nets or sort the fish afterwards. Daytime work for people that were being hired. Now in Luke 5, again, you'll also see that they were washing their nets in the daytime. And you'll also notice that this is the situation where Simon Peter says, Master, we've worked hard all night and haven't caught anything, but because you say so, I will let down the nets. So that's the trammel net again. Okay. So going back to the beginning of the passage in Luke 5, he saw at the water's edge two boats left there by the fishermen who were washing their nets. And then he said, put out into deep water and let down the nets for a catch. Now, this is weird, isn't it? Because this is daytime, and Peter's inevitably going to say here, look, I'm the fisherman, I know what we're doing. We've worked hard all night, we've let down our trammel nets all night, didn't catch anything. I don't know if you ever noticed, but the first miracle in this passage is not that when they let down the nets, like Jesus said, that they got loads of fish. It's the fact that they worked hard all night and caught nothing. That did not happen. That was almost a miracle because Galilee was so full of fish, you couldn't work all night with the trammel net and not catch anything unless God was involved in some way. So that was the first extraordinary thing. We caught nothing. Then Jesus says, well, now do it this way and at daytime. What? Nonsense. But when their partners in the other boat, and they had to signal them over because there were so many fish. The boats often worked in partnership at the time with trammel nets. The drag net only had one boat. Okay, does that make sense?
Yeah.
Seeing the sort of nets that they were using and what was going on. There's one more net. When I get back to my pictures. And that's the cast net. There's a guy with a cast net. And it's called a cast net because he casts it, or he throws it. It's a remarkable skill that they had to learn. And you see what happens, that it's all folded up on their arm So that's the skill of it, is first of all to fold it all together. It's circular. It can be up to 8 meters in diameter, and it's got little bits of lead around the edge again, as you can see. And this is the work of a single fisherman, not a crew, but a single fisherman. He ranges it on his right arm. He can stand either in a boat or in shallow water. So this is done on the edge of the lake. And then he just hurls it out. And as he hurls it out, it fans out, and it can go a long way. And it lands a bit like a parachute. There's a picture of a guy doing it. And with the lead weights, it sinks. Okay? It doesn't sink very far because it's in the small, shallow water. And it's got a very wide span when it's fully extended. So it would again catch a lot of fish. And depending on the size of the mesh, you could either catch the bigger fish or the sardines. So you can have cast nets of different kinds for different fishes. So you'd know where they were, you'd know where the large fish were, or the small fish, so you use your cast net accordingly. It might have a series of cords for pulling it back in again, particularly if it was catching the larger fish, which would be heavy. But usually the fisherman then had to dive down and either remove the fish from the net, or if there weren't that many, he could drag the whole net back up himself. Otherwise, he would dive down, he would take the fish out, and he would have to then bring them back, put them in a pouch or something at the end of the whole procedure. If it was right on the edge of the shore, he could probably drag it in. If you're a really good fisherman, you would have to get used to all 3 different ways of doing it. I thought I had another picture. Oh, I've lost one of my pictures. There's a really nice picture of a cast net when it's all spread out, but anyway, you got the idea. There's a mention of it in Ezekiel, and then there's a mention of it in Mark, where we were a moment ago. Let's see what Ezekiel says first of all. Okay, it's just God saying, with a great throng of people, I will cast my net over you. They will haul you up in my net. So, just casting your net. But how do you know that in Mark, in those verses, it's a cast net? It's obvious in mine, verse 16. He saw Simon and his brother Andrew casting a net into the lake. So while James and John were busy preparing and washing mending their nets ready for the next night, Simon and Andrew were actually doing some fishing. They were casting their net in. And then I'm going to show you one more thing that happened here. Because if you're really skillful, of course, you didn't just do one thing or the other. So it might look like that. Now this was called a veranda net, and there's a cast net as well. And actually, what you're meant to see there is there's a trammel net going down. Can you see that there's something going down into the water? And then there's a sort of another thing around the edge. So I can't really show you because I can't point to my own screen, and it helps with it. But what you should be able to see is that as well as somebody in the middle casting a net, they've also let down trammel nets, and then there's another boat laying on the surface of the water, the veranda, and that way you really catch just about everything. Multi-purpose. So they sometimes did all that sort of thing. Sometimes called a sort of, not quite called a bowel net, but he had the impression of it being like a bowel structure. And of course, any fish that thought they could escape by jumping out, got caught on the veranda bit. So, and if they weren't going to go anywhere, if they're just swimming around in the middle, you've either got them with the cast net, or you frighten them into the other nets.
Huh.
Now, before I tell you 3 final things to finish with, here's your final passage to look at. John 21, which we said happened at Tabka. Do you remember the map from the beginning? The place where this happened. This is the breakfast on the shore. And the question is, I'll leave it with you, a couple of minutes, have a read of it. What kind of net is being used in John 21? See if you can work out the clues from the passage about the different nets.
Aha.
Trammel net is one of them.
Because? What's the clue for the trammel net?
Trammel net, because they were at night and there was 4 of them.
Right. They went out, but that night, again, they caught nothing. It's a similar story to the one in Luke, but it is a different occasion, but another miracle. All night, catching nothing. Yeah, definitely, there's a trammel net involved there. And as you say, although there were 7 of them altogether, that's not enough anyway for a dragnet, is it?
No.
There's no way they could do a dragnet. But there would be 2 boats there, and 7 of them in those 2 boats. So there's definitely a trammel net. There might have been a veranda net with it. Is there anything else that you'll find there?
Talks about another little boat coming out,
Yeah.
not far off,
Yes.
dragging the net.
Once it was full, yes. But notice verse 6. What happens to the net there?
Cast.
Yeah, throw your net on the right side and you'll find some. Not let them down, but throw them.
All right.
And that's the one where they were unable to haul the net in because of the large number of fish. Normally, with a cast net, you didn't catch that many in one go. It was a sort of process you just kept on doing and getting more each time. But yes, they did have to call in the second boat. And apparently, the text does suggest 2 boats. Does it say small boat in one of yours translations, or little boat?
Yeah.
Yeah. There's 2 different Greek words used there for boat. And it may be that in most English translations it just says boat. But definitely there's another boat, a small boat. Perhaps one of the boats was Peter's, and one of them might have still been James and John had a boat. So there's lots of nets going on here. Well, everything except a drag net anyway. There's lots of boats going in. They probably caught musht fish, 353 of them. It was full of large fish. You pick that up in verse 11. Okay, so that was probably the musht fish, which is where, and at this time you would find a lot of them. Certainly not sardines. Sardines, of course, I should have mentioned, were the small fish that's mentioned in the feeding of the 5,000. When the lad had, what did he have? 5 loaves. No, we'll get it that way round. How many loaves and how many fishes? Which way round was it?
5 loaves, 2 fish.
There's 2 fishes, yes, but they were little fish. It actually says in the text, little fish. They would be the sardines. That was your picnic fish, not your big sit-down meal, family-type gathering, and so on. And people often say, well, what about this number, 153? Any great insights into this? The 153 fish? Here's my big insight into the number 153. It tells me this. They counted them. Well, of course they did. They were fishermen. They got a huge catch. Of course they wanted to boast about it. Of course they counted them. But actually, you probably usually counted your fish for tax reasons. You have to sort of declare your income. And also, as I said earlier, if you're part of a team and you need to know how to split the income up, you would need to know how many you caught. So you can make up your own reasons why there's 153, if you like. I'm not going to get.
I've had something interesting recently. It was a very special number to the Greeks.
Ah.
The only number we've ever discovered where the number is the sum of the cube of the individual digits.
Very, very helpful, David. Thank you so much.
Very deep spiritual insight, that, isn't it?
Yes,
It's
it
the
is.
only number we've ever discovered where that even with modern computers, but the Greeks worshipped this number. It was
Yes, for those that are not following that, 1 cubed is 1, 5 cubed is 125, 3 cubed is 27. Add them up, you get 153.
Absolutely.
And I can't prove it's the only one that occurs, but
they've had big computers trying to do it because the Greeks spent years trying to find other numbers manually, and then tried it on computers, and they've never found another number like this.
No, and I guess now it's got so big it'd be very difficult for that to happen.
But the Greeks had a strange thing with numbers. Pythagoras, of the famous theorem, once killed one of his students for suggesting that numbers could be negative. They didn't have negative.
Yes.
Because they worship numbers like gods.
They did indeed, yeah. I want to say 3 other useful little things, I hope, before we finish. There is another kind of... Oh, sorry, that's me just being clever with that. Forget that. In Matthew 17, there's another fishing story. And this is, go and get the text for us. Yeah? Now, I think that's the one, isn't it? I've lost my notes at the moment. Things like that. The fish and the temple tax. Now, what kind of net is used here?
A hook.
Yeah, quick question. Not a net at all. It's a line and a hook. So this is angling. Okay? Not football fishing, this is angling. Anyone could angle on the, if that's the right way of putting it, anyone could do angling on the lake. Angling is free and open to all. For a fisherman, you needed to have a license. You needed to have fishing rights. And of course, there was something in its mouth. Yeah? If there's something in its mouth, the chances are it would be a mushed fish. Because that used to pick up little objects when it wasn't carrying the fertilized eggs. It would often pick up tiny objects like coins. So if someone had dropped their petrol over the side of the boat, it might well have picked it up. The trouble is that the mushed fish, which feeds on plankton, is caught in nets only. The hook and line method was used to catch finny or barbel because you used to put a sardine as bait on it. Okay? So you would catch a barbel with a hook and line by putting a sardine on it. And mush would tend to ignore a hook or a line. So you've got a choice of miracles here. You can either say it's a musht which shouldn't have been caught this way, but that was the miracle, or you could say they caught a barbel fish and it shouldn't have had something in its mouth, and it did. So there you are, there's 2 miracles for the price of 1 there. Actually, I've already mentioned the feeding of the 4,000, 5,000, which was sardines. But one final comment from me. Matthew 7, 9 to 10. If any of you ask for a fish, etc., etc. If one asks for bread, will he give him a stone? If he asks for fish, will he give him a snake? Anyone have a different word instead of snake? Verse 10, that is.
Scorpion.
Maybe a different word in their Bible. The snake.
Scorpion.
I can't hear you very well. Someone saying
Scorpion.
still can't hear it. Sorry. Now,
Scorpion.
scorpion. That's the word you have.
I think I've read that somewhere.
Oh, I see. You read it somewhere, wasn't there? Okay.
I've got serpent.
Yes. Okay. Now, does that still make any sense? This is a fishing analogy, and when you drag your net in, you don't always just get nice fish, do you? You get all the other rubbish that's in the lake, and in fact, you wouldn't get a snake as such, or a serpent as such. You get a water snake, commonly known for us as an eel.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, why was that no good? What did they do with the eels? They couldn't sell them.
They wouldn't eat it.
They couldn't eat it. It's unclean. Okay. So they'll have to throw those back. So I'm assuming here that this picture, if he asked for a fish, would he give him a snake? Could well be, a water snake, an eel type thing. And in fact, the other problem that the fishermen had with their nets is they would also catch lots and lots of stones in it, and they'd just have to throw those back. But the picture there is bread and stone, not fish and stone. But it could have been, if he asked for a fish, would he give him a stone? Because they would also pick up lots of stones in their nets as well. There you are. It's the frustration of fishing. You don't always get the nice fish you want. Now, in all the lot of the stories about the fish from the Gospels, there is a sort of evangelistic message behind all this. The kingdom of heaven is like, and so on. People have often used the fishing analogy, inevitably be fishers of men. And you can, if you want to go away and think about this, you can pick up lots of different pictures of evangelism from the fishing. The dragnet approach, where you preach to crowds and try and get lots of people to come in, but you get some that respond and some that don't. Or this more individual fishing, the sort of friendship evangelism, the one-to-one, the ones where you're on your own casting your net in your workplace or whatever, and you're trying to fish men that way. So all these different types, you might like to think, how does this apply to evangelism, or me being a witness, or me being a fisher of men? Because that in the end is what Jesus wants. Right. Well, we're going to fly away from Galilee now, and you can all go home or whatever, back home where you are. That's fishing on Galilee.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks very much.
Before I go, is Steve still there, by the way? Is Steve gone?
Yeah, I'm back.
You're back. Okay. I just want to say something about this. Is that okay, Steve?
Yeah, go on.
This has been an experiment. It's been me trying to handle lots of bits of paper and a Bible all around me in front of my laptop. Did that come across okay?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well done.
Excellent.
It works from my point of view. And it works from your point of view. You can follow me. I wasn't going too fast.
Yeah. You can come back.
Negative comments. Let's hear them now, because I want to know whether to keep on doing this.
No, you've got to come back.
Keep on doing it.
I've got to come back.
Yeah.
Okay, well, you'll hear eventually what I'm going to do, but in mid-November onwards, I want to do a weekly series. And if you've been at the Foundations conferences, you might have heard me talk about this. And who's going to be at F10? Anyone going to be in Devon soon?
Yes. Yes.
I'll mention it then, advertise it then. I'm going to look at what I call opening the ancient wells, which is how to get into the Bible better, given that we've done lots of things to the Bible, which sort of gets in the way of good reading and so on. So I've done this before, but I want to think how I do this now in this format, and we'll see what happens. There'll be a lot more where I'm not saying so much, and you'll have a chance to try it out almost as well, because it's all about reading the Bible. Right, nothing else from me, I don't think. I wouldn't mind a quick word with you, Steve, before we all go.
Yep.
But I've finished. I finished.
Well done.
Okay, thank you.
Dave, you're going to turn the video off now. Recording.
Yeah. Okay, I will stop.